Everything you were told about the 12 disciples is wrong. They were not 12 men who walked through Galilee, ate fish by the Sea of Tiberias, and watched their friend die on a cross. That is not what the gospel says. That is what a series of political councils 4 centuries later decided you would hear. And the decision was not accidental. It was a choice to bury something so dangerous that if it ever surfaced, the entire structure of institutional faith would collapse. This is not a conspiracy theory. This is not metaphor. This is a forensic recovery of a map that has been sitting inside the Bible for 2,000 years, waiting for the right set of eyes. And if you pay attention, truly pay attention, you will never read the Gospels the same way again. Here is the paradox. Billions of people have read the story of the 12 disciples. Churches have been named after them. Entire theological systems rest on their literal existence. And yet, the earliest Christian writings, the ones that predate the Gospels by decades, never treat them as historical figures. Paul, who wrote before Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, barely mentions the disciples at all. When he does not describe them as men walking alongside Jesus. He describes them as pillars, not people. Structures, foundations, functions. Who benefited from turning a psychological map into a historical narrative? The same people who always benefit, those who wanted you to look outward instead of inward. If the disciples are 12 literal men who lived 2,000 years ago, their story is over. You can admire them, you can pray to them, but you can never become them. The power stays outside you. The moment you realize they are inside you, the moment you realize every single character in the gospel is a part of your own consciousness, the power moves, and the door you were told to knock on from the outside swings, open from within. This video changes that permanently. By the end of this narrative, you will not see 12 men. You will see 12 mirrors reflecting back at you. Now, stop for a second. Let me ask you something directly. Have you ever read the Gospel of Matthew and felt like the disciples were flat? They are always misunderstanding something. They are always asking the wrong question. They are always missing the point. And Jesus is perpetually frustrated with them. Are you still so dull, he says? Do you not yet understand? If these are literal historical eyewitnesses watching a literal divine being perform literal miracles, how could they possibly be this confused? The cognitive dissonance is deafening. But nobody talks about it because the alternative is too destabilizing. The alternative is this. The disciples are not failing to understand Jesus. They are failing to understand themselves. They are parts of the human psyche that have not yet been integrated. And Jesus is not a man teaching men. He is the integrated self, the higher consciousness, trying to wake up the fragmented pieces that constitute your mind. That is why every gospel scene reads like therapy. That is why the disciples never learn, but Jesus never stops teaching. The story is not about history. It is about the architecture of awakening. Remember what I said at the beginning. This is exactly what I meant. Now let me show you who buried this and why. The suppression happened in the 4th century at the Council of Nicaea and the councils that followed. The Emperor Constantine needed a unified religion to unify a fractured empire. But the early Christian texts were not unified. Some Gospels describe Jesus as a cosmic principle. Others, like the Gospel of Thomas, contain sayings but no narrative, a collection of teachings without a story to attach them to. The Gospel of Philip described the disciples as names for spiritual states. These texts were not lost. They were outlawed, burned, and buried. Then a single narrative was selected, the synoptic story of a literal man with literal disciples, because narrative controls attention, and attention controls belief, and belief controls behavior. The theologian Origen, writing in the 3rd century, knew exactly what was happening. He warned that reading the Gospels literally was a form of spiritual blindness. He said the stories contain a body, soul, and spirit, and only the body is the literal event. Most people, he wrote, never go beyond the body. They mistake the shell for the seed. Origen was eventually declared a heretic. His writings were mutilated. The spiritual interpretation was driven underground, and the literal narrative took the throne. Now watch what happens when you read the Gospels through the original lens. If something just shifted in how you read this story, if the idea that Origen was silenced for teaching this is starting to resonate, drop the word mirror in the comments, and tell me which of these 12 functions you recognized first in yourself. Subscribe to keep walking through these stories with us. Each one decodes a different psychological pattern hidden in the text. And what comes next is how the resurrection becomes an event you live, not just one you read about. The word used for disciple in the Greek text is mathetes. It means learner, but not the kind of learner who memorizes facts. It means someone who undergoes internal transformation through apprenticeship. The mathetes is not a student in a classroom. He is someone who lives with the master, eats with him, sleeps near him, and slowly absorbs his way of being. The transformation is not cognitive, it is cellular, it is ontological. And here's the crucial point that no translator ever tells you. The mathetes is always plural in the Gospels, but it is never a committee. It is a collective of individual transformations happening simultaneously. Each disciple is a different path. Each disciple is a different function of the soul, being reshaped in a different way. Modern neuroscience calls this modularity of mind. The brain is not a single unified organ that thinks one thought at a time. It is a collection of specialized systems. The narrative interpreter, the threat detector, the social bonding module, the planning center, the emotional memory bank, each running its own processes in parallel. These systems do not automatically agree. They conflict, they compete, they override one another. The feeling of being a single unified self is an illusion produced by the left hemisphere's storytelling function, which weaves these competing voices into a coherent narrative after the fact. This is it. This is the entire structure of the Gospels in the language of the 21st century. The 12 disciples are not 12 men. They are the 12 main functional systems of the human mind, each one personified as a character so you can see them, name them, and eventually integrate them. Think about that. The ancient text encoded a neuroscientific model of consciousness 2,000 years before anyone had an fMRI machine. And then the literalists buried it. Let me name them for you. Peter is the executive function, the decision maker, the one who speaks first, acts first, and usually regrets it. Neuroscientifically, Peter is your prefrontal cortex, the part that plans, initiates, and takes credit. But Peter is also the one who denies Jesus 3 times before the rooster crows. That is not a historical event. That is a psychological pattern. Your executive function denies the higher self every time it chooses safety over truth, every time it says, "I don't know him," to avoid the cost of alignment. And when Peter weeps bitterly afterward, that is the remorse that comes when your own decision-making system betrays you. James and John are the sons of thunder. They want to call down fire from heaven. They want vengeance, power, and recognition. These are the amygdala-driven systems of fear and aggression. They are the parts of you that react instantly when threatened, that want to destroy what you cannot control. Their mother asks Jesus to let them sit at his right and left in the kingdom. The mother is expectation, inherited conditioning that demands reward for loyalty. And Jesus refuses, because the kingdom does not work that way. Andrew is the bridge. He is the first to recognize Jesus and immediately goes to find his brother, Peter. In psychological terms, Andrew is intuition, the pattern recognition system that sees connections before conscious thought can explain them. Every time you have a hunch that turns out to be true, that is Andrew moving before Peter can decide. Now here is where it gets dangerous, because the 12 disciples are not all cooperative. One of them is the traitor. And if you think that is only about Judas, you are still reading the story wrong. Judas is not a villain. Judas is a function. He is the part of the psyche that sells out the self for immediate gain. 30 pieces of silver is the price of betrayal. But 30 pieces of silver in the ancient world was the compensation for a slave accidentally gored by an ox. It is the price of a life that was never lived. Judas is your survival instinct so corrupted by scarcity that it trades eternity for a coin. Every time you betray your own deepest truth for comfort, approval, or security, Judas is operating inside you. And the kiss? That is the most devastating part. The betrayal is not done by an enemy. It is done by a part of you that once walked alongside the truth, that once knew the truth, that touched it, and still chose to sell it. The kiss is the moment you pretend to love what you are about to destroy. This is where it changes everything. Now look at Thomas. Thomas doubts. He is the skeptic, the empiricist, the one who will not believe until he sees the wound and touches the flesh. Thomas is your left hemisphere, the part that demands proof, that tests reality, that refuses to accept anything it cannot verify. And the story does not condemn Thomas for doubting. Jesus does not send him away. He shows him the wounds. He says, "Reach out your hand and put it into my side." The mystic truth is not destroyed by skepticism. It is confirmed by it. The higher self does not require blind faith. It offers direct evidence. And then Jesus says, "Blessed are those who have not seen and yet have believed." That is not a rejection of Thomas. That is an invitation to the next stage of development, where you no longer need to touch the wound because you have integrated the knowing. Now stop and notice something. The number 12 itself is not arbitrary. 12 is the number of completion in the ancient world. 12 tribes of Israel, 12 months of the year, 12 hours of daylight, 12 signs of the zodiac. The disciples are not a historical count. They are a cosmological statement. The human mind, when fully integrated, contains 12 distinct functions. 12 is the architecture of a complete self. The gospel is not reporting an event. It is prescribing a transformation. Carl Jung knew this. He spent his entire career mapping the archetypes of the collective unconscious, and he kept arriving at the same structural numbers. The 12 disciples, for Jung, were the 12 functions of the individuated psyche. The self, Jung said, is not a single thing. It is a mandala of integrated opposites. And the mandala of Christianity? It is the crucifixion surrounded by the 12. The cross is the intersection of time and eternity. The 12 are the complete set of human faculties arranged around that intersection, waiting to be unified. Joseph Campbell took it further. He showed that the hero's journey, the universal narrative pattern found in every culture, is identical to the gospel structure. The call, the departure, the trials, the death, the resurrection, the return with the gift. Campbell said the Gospels are not history reported as myth. They are myth told as history. The 12 disciples are not witnesses to the hero's journey. They are the faculties that must be awakened in the hero himself. You are the hero. The disciples are the parts of you that must wake up. And modern neuroscience says the same thing. Antonio Damasio, the neuroscientist who mapped the relationship between emotion and consciousness, described the self as a three-layered structure: the proto-self, the core self, and the autobiographical self. Each layer corresponds to a different level of integration, and the highest level, the autobiographical self, only emerges when all the lower functions are fully connected. That is what the gospel shows. Jesus gathers the disciples, he walks with them. He teaches them, he dies. And after the resurrection, the disciples are transformed. They become apostles. They become teachers themselves. The integration is complete. And when we come back to this in a moment, I will take you deeper into what the resurrection actually means, not as a biological miracle, but as a psychological event that happens inside you whenever the fragmented parts of your mind finally unify. But before we go there, pause. Sit with what you have already seen. If you are seeing yourself in these 12 functions, if Peter, Judas, or Thomas just stopped being ancient names and started being parts of you, that is the recognition we are after. Subscribe before the next chapter, because what comes next changes how you read every Bible story you thought you knew. And drop the name of the function you recognized first in the comments, the one that made you stop and say, "That is me." That is the one the higher self is calling to order inside you right now. Now think about what that means for you, right now, in this moment. The gospel is not a story about someone else 2,000 years ago. It is a diagnostic model of your own consciousness. Every character is a function you are currently operating. Every conflict is a conflict you are currently experiencing. Every teaching is a prescription for your own integration. And the resurrection is not a future event you wait for. It is the present possibility of becoming whole. And this is where it gets worse, because most people never reach the resurrection. They stay in the crucifixion. They keep the parts of themselves separate. They let Peter dominate. They let Judas run in the background. They let Thomas demand proof while never actually testing the truth. They let James and John burn with reactive anger. They never integrate. And that is the tragedy of the unexamined life. The gospel offers transformation. Most people read it as history and miss the call. But you are not most people. You are here. You have stayed this far. And if what you are hearing is starting to shift something fundamental in the way you read these texts, then something inside you is already moving toward integration. That is not an accident. That is the higher self calling the disciples to order inside your own mind. Now let me show you the layer underneath. The Greek word for disciple, mathetes, is related to another word, mathema, which means that which is learned. But mathema also carries the sense of a lesson that transforms the learner. It is not information transfer. It is ontological reshaping, and here is the neuroscience that proves the ancient writers knew exactly what they were describing. Your brain has a property called neuroplasticity. It rewires itself based on repeated experience. When you practice a new behavior, the neural pathways associated with that behavior strengthen. When you stop practicing, they weaken. This is how learning happens at the biological level. But here is the part that matters. Neuroplasticity is not just about skills, it is about identity. When you repeatedly choose a new pattern of thought or action, the brain actually restructures itself to support that pattern. The old pathways atrophy, new ones grow. You are not the same person after a sustained practice. The structure of your consciousness changes. Now read the Gospels with that knowledge. Jesus says, "Follow me." He does not say, "Agree with me." He says, "Come, walk with me, eat with me, sleep near me, learn my way of being." That is apprenticeship. That is repeated practice. That is neuroplasticity. The disciple is not someone who believes a set of propositions. The disciple is someone whose brain is being rewired through sustained proximity to the higher self. And after 3 years, the traditional length of discipleship in the ancient world, the rewiring is complete. The disciple becomes the master, the function becomes integrated, and the old self, the pre-discipleship consciousness, dies. That is the crucifixion of the ego, and the new self, the integrated consciousness, is born. That is the resurrection. Think about that for a moment. The entire gospel narrative is a step-by-step protocol for neural transformation, the pathway from fragmentation to wholeness, from the scattered self to the unified self. And it was written down in a language that could be understood on 2 levels simultaneously: the literal, which would preserve it through ages of ignorance, and the psychological, which would only be decoded when the science advanced enough to recognize it. Joseph Campbell called this the monomyth. He said the hero's journey is the universal story of transformation, and it appears in every culture because it is not a cultural invention. It is a biological and psychological necessity. The call to adventure, the threshold crossing, the road of trials, the supreme ordeal, the reward, the return. The Gospels follow this structure exactly. Jesus is the hero. The disciples are the companions. But here is what Campbell knew that most theologians miss. The hero and the companions are the same consciousness at different stages. Jesus is the integrated self. The disciples are the fragmented parts. The journey is the process of integration, and the resurrection is the moment when fragmentation ends. Ian McGilchrist, the psychiatrist who wrote The Master and His Emissary, described the relationship between the brain's hemispheres in terms that mirror the gospel exactly. The right hemisphere, the master, sees the whole, the interconnected, the implicit, the embodied. The left hemisphere, the emissary, takes things apart, analyzes, categorizes, and claims authority. The emissary, McGilchrist argues, has usurped the master. The left hemisphere now believes it is in charge. It reduces the world to what it can measure and control. And it has lost sight of the whole, that is, the gospel. That is the story of the disciples who keep misunderstanding because they are stuck in the left hemisphere's mode of perception, while Jesus, the master, the right hemisphere, keeps trying to show them the whole. And the crucifixion, that is what happens when the emissary kills the master. And the resurrection, that is the master returning, not as a competitor, but as the restored center of integration. You have felt this. You know the experience of being trapped in your own left hemisphere, overthinking, analyzing, reducing everything to data, losing the sense of meaning, feeling fragmented. And you also know the moments when the right hemisphere breaks through, when you see the whole, feel the connection, experience the meaning, know that you are more than the sum of your parts. Those moments are glimpses of integration. They are the resurrection breaking through the crucifixion of daily fragmentation. And here is what nobody tells you about that process. It is not a one-time event. It is a continuous practice. The disciples did not become integrated and then stay integrated. They faltered. They doubted. They scattered. Peter denied. Thomas doubted. Judas betrayed. And yet, after the resurrection, they were reassembled. They were reintegrated at a higher level. The gospel does not end with the disciples never struggling again. It ends with them becoming the church, which means becoming a community of integrated functions, a collective consciousness, a body that carries the higher self forward. That is your life. You will integrate and then you will fragment again. You will feel whole and then you will feel scattered. That is not failure. That is the pattern. The resurrection is not a destination. It is a rhythm. You die to the old self. You rise to the new. You die again. You rise again. Each time, the integration is deeper. Each time, the self is more whole. The gospel is not a story you watch. It is a cycle you live. Now look at your own life with the eyes you have been given in this video. Look at the people you struggle with. Every conflict with another person is a conflict between parts of yourself that you have not yet integrated. The person who triggers your anger is James or John inside you. The person who provokes your skepticism is Thomas. The person you resent for their success is the part of you that chose safety instead. Every external conflict is an internal map. Read it. Follow the lines. Find the function that is not yet integrated, and do not cast it out. Call it to the table. Let it become a disciple. Look at the patterns you repeat. That is Peter walking on water and then sinking. You have the capacity. You step out of the boat. You begin to walk. And then you look at the waves, the evidence of your limitations, the fear of failure, the voice that says you cannot, and you sink. But Peter does not drown. Jesus reaches out his hand. The higher self does not abandon the sinking function. It lifts it up. You of little faith, why did you doubt? That is not a condemnation. It is a gentle reminder. You knew you could. You just forgot. Remember, look at the places where you feel stuck. That is Judas. That is the part of you that has made a deal with the survival instinct. You sold your deepest truth for something smaller, a paycheck, a relationship that does not fulfill you, a reputation you do not respect, a comfort that feels like death. And you know it. You sit at the table with it every day. You dip bread into the same bowl. And the higher self inside you is waiting for you to realize that the deal is not working. The betrayal must be exposed, not to punish you, to free you. This is the whole pattern. The 12 disciples are you. Jesus is what you are becoming. The gospel is the process. And the resurrection is not something you wait for. It is something you participate in. Every time you integrate a fragment, every time you call a lost function home, every time you die to an old identity and let a new one emerge. That is the resurrection happening in real time, in your brain, in your consciousness, in your life. And now you see it. You cannot unsee it. Every time you read the Gospels from now on, you will feel these 12 functions inside you. You will recognize Peter making decisions. You will see Thomas demanding proof. You will feel James and John burning with reaction. You will notice Judas calculating in the background. And you will hear the voice of the integrated self saying, "Come, follow me." Not out there, in here. If this has shifted something permanent in how you see the text, if the Bible has become a map of your own mind, and you are not going back, then do not let this end here. Subscribe so you do not miss what comes next, because the resurrection we are about to explore is not a past event. It is the pattern your own consciousness is ready to live. And in the comments, tell me which function you are ready to call home first. I will be there, reading everyone,